On a cold December morning in the year 1485, only months after the Battle of Bosworth turned England's destiny upside down, a new royal order began reshaping the future of a kingdom still trembling from decades of civil war. The Tudors, a family once considered minor Welsh gentry, now occupied the throne through Henry Tudor's unlikely triumph over King Richard Roman III. No one in that winter could have imagined that the political bargains, marriages, betrayals, and dark legacies forged in those years would echo through the centuries, reaching all the way into the bloodstream of a princess born more than 500 years later at a quiet country estate in Norfolk. That princess was Diana Frances Spencer, and within her elegant lineage, carefully charted by genealogists and silently preserved in royal memory, lay a thread connecting her to the powerful, often ruthless world of the Tudor dynasty. To understand what sinister Tudor legacy hides in Princess Diana's bloodline, we first step back into the violent world that birthed the Tudor monarchy. England in the late 15th century was exhausted. The Wars of the Roses had ripped apart noble families for more than 30 years. Loyalties shifted constantly, armies marched across the country, and rival claimants from the houses of Lancaster and York believed they held divine right to rule. It was in this chaos that Henry Tudor rose. His claim to the throne was weak, drawn from a complicated line through Margaret Beaufort, whose legitimacy was debated even in her own time. Yet politics, alliances, and timing crowned him King Henry Roman VII. The Tudors knew their grip on power was fragile. They needed legitimacy, heirs, and alliances. This meant carefully arranged marriages and the binding of noble families to the monarchy through blood and obligation. These decisions would ripple outward for generations. Among those families pulled into the Tudor circle were the Spencers, ancestors of Princess Diana. Though the Spencers truly rose to prominence later, during the 17th century, their earlier branches connected them to noble lines interwoven with the Tudors themselves. Through these shared ancestors, Diana carried in her veins the same legacy that shaped monarchs like Henry Roman VIII and his formidable daughter, Elizabeth I. One of the clearest Tudor-era connections in Diana's ancestry appears through the powerful Bolin family. The Boleyns were wealthy, ambitious courtiers who rose to dizzying heights when Anne Boleyn captured the attention of Henry Roman VIII. Anne was educated, persuasive, and brilliant, but she entered a court where influence was a dangerous currency, and kings demanded absolute loyalty. Her marriage to Henry Roman VIII, following the king's dramatic break from the Catholic Church, changed English history forever, yet it also cast a long shadow. Anne Boleyn would die by execution in 1536 after accusations of adultery, treason, and incest, charges now widely recognized by historians as politically motivated. Through Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, the Boleyn lineage continued quietly through generations of English aristocracy. One of these branches ultimately led to the Spencers, and eventually to Diana. This connection is more than genealogical trivia. It represents the survival of a family that once stood at the very heart of Tudor power politics, a family that witnessed the rise of Protestant England, the fall of monastic institutions, and the violent reshaping of the monarchy. The Bolin bloodline carried the memory of a woman executed by her own husband and a dynasty founded on both ambition and fear. Diana, centuries later, unknowingly inherited this story, and the parallels between Anne's life and her own have fascinated historians and royal commentators alike. But the Tudor legacy in Diana's bloodline does not end with the Boleyns. Another significant connection reaches back to the powerful Beaufort family. Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Roman VII, was one of the most influential women of the 15th century. Intelligent, politically astute, and fiercely ambitious, she orchestrated alliances, funded rebellions, and ultimately positioned her son to claim the throne. Her descendants married into multiple noble families, spreading Beaufort blood across England's aristocracy. Through these lines, Princess Diana was linked to the mother of the first Tudor king, tying her to the very foundation of the dynasty. Margaret Beaufort's legacy was not gentle. She lived through war, betrayal, and survival. She believed absolutely in divine destiny, especially for her son. The Tudor claim to the throne was deeply intertwined with her relentless efforts, and through the centuries, her bloodline wound its way into families like the Spencers, who would eventually rise to their own prominence. This meant that Diana was connected not only to Tudor royalty, but to the political architects of the dynasty itself. Another striking link emerges through the Grey family, descendants of Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of Edward Roman IV. Elizabeth Woodville was a controversial figure in her own time, accused by her enemies of manipulation and dark influence. She was blamed for dividing the court, pushing her relatives into power, and creating the rivalry that preceded the fall of the House of York. Her daughter, Elizabeth of York, married Henry Roman VII, uniting Lancaster and York. Through various lines, Elizabeth Woodville's descendants merged with the ancestors of Princess Diana, adding yet another Tudor-era influence to her lineage. Elizabeth Woodville's reputation, clouded by accusations of sorcery and political scheming, contributed to the long-standing narrative of dangerous women surrounding royal power. Though much of it was propaganda, it reveals the perilous world that shaped the Tudor dynasty, and through ancestry, the world that shaped Diana's heritage. When Princess Diana was born on July 1, 1961, at Park House on the Queen's Sandringham estate, she entered a world far removed from the brutal politics of the 15th and 16th centuries, yet the blood she inherited carried the memory of those centuries. It carried the ambition of the Beauforts, the tragedy of the Boleyns, and the cunning survival of the Woodvilles. As historians later noted, Diana was not merely a commoner marrying into royalty, as some newspapers portrayed her. In truth, she carried lines as ancient and royal as those of the Windsors. She shared ancestry with kings, queens, and some of the most influential political figures in English history. The sinister aspect of this Tudor legacy lies not in supernatural curses or mystical lore, but in the very real consequences of dynastic ambition. The Tudors lived in a world where power was maintained through fear, where marriages were political weapons, and where betrayal was rewarded with death. The families tied to them shared their fate, navigating courts full of espionage, manipulation, and constant danger. To inherit a Tudor bloodline was to inherit a past shaped by violence and survival. For Diana, centuries later, echoes of this legacy would emerge in symbolic ways. Like Anne Boleyn, she would become a woman adored by the public, yet isolated within a palace. Like Elizabeth Woodville, she would face scrutiny and rumors, and like the Beauforts, her life would be entwined with the institutions shaping the British monarchy. To understand the deeper, more unsettling elements of Princess Diana's Tudor inheritance, we must step into the spaces of Tudor England that history often describes as glittering and magnificent, yet which were in truth dangerous arenas where ambition, fear, and secrecy shaped every life. Behind the polished marble floors of palaces like Hampton Court and Greenwich, behind the elaborate tapestries and feasts, lay a political culture built on suspicion. Even the highest born could fall suddenly, violently, and without mercy. This environment birthed legacies of trauma, paranoia, and ruthless survival instincts that would be passed down through generations. Long after the Tudors themselves vanished, echoes of this world still resonated in the families connected to them, including the ancestors of Princess Diana. One of the most haunting aspects of Tudor royal politics was its reliance on control. Kings and queens used marriages, inheritances, lands, and titles as tools to manipulate the nobility. Any family with a claim to the throne, or even a whisper of influence, became both valuable and vulnerable. The Tudor court was especially notorious for its network of spies. Men like Sir Thomas Cromwell, who rose under Henry Roman VIII, oversaw systems of intelligence gathering that extended into every corner of the kingdom. Letters were intercepted, conversations reported, and loyalty constantly tested. Even powerful families like the Boleyns, who had a daughter married to the king, lived under the constant threat of royal suspicion. Mary Boleyn, from whom Princess Diana descends, experienced the danger of this world firsthand. Though she survived the bloody downfall that consumed her sister Anne, Mary's life was shaped by the same system of exploitation that elevated and destroyed many Tudor courtiers. She had been used for political advantage, rumoured to be Henry Roman VIII's mistress before Anne. When her family rose to power, Mary was a pawn. When the Boleyns fell, she was abandoned. After Anne's execution, Mary lived quietly, forgotten by the court, her existence a reminder of how quickly fortunes changed. The shadow of this trauma persisted in her descendants, generations who learned that proximity to power brought not just opportunity but danger. The darker threads of the Tudor legacy also include the dynasty's brutal policy toward threats, real or imagined. Henry Roman VIII's reign alone is marked by a long list of executions carried out to protect the throne. George Boleyn, Anne's brother and another ancestor, linked through extended lines to noble families of Diana's heritage, died as a result of accusations historians now consider fabricated. His death was part of a wave of purges that removed those the king believed could challenge him. This climate of fear shaped the noble families connected to the Tudors, forcing them into strategies of survival that involved loyalty, silence, and absolute obedience. These traits, ingrained over generations, influenced how aristocratic families behaved during the centuries that followed. One of the families most profoundly shaped by Tudor politics was the Grey family. Lady Jane Grey, the tragic 9 Days Queen, was a descendant of Elizabeth Woodville, and thus linked to the same family lines, later mingling with the Spencers. Jane's execution in 1554 remains one of the most poignant symbols of Tudor ruthlessness. She was only 16 or 17, caught in the schemes of ambitious nobles who hoped to control the throne. Her death was less about her actions and more about the political threat she represented to Mary I. The legacy of the Greys was one of brilliance mixed with vulnerability. Their lineage carried both royal blood and the scars of political manipulation. This legacy was inherited through various branches by families that eventually produced Diana. Another powerful Tudor connection lies through the Hastings family, an important noble house with direct involvement in the struggles of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The Hastings were close to the Yorkist kings and later found ways to survive under the Tudors, often through careful neutrality. Their story is one of balancing loyalty and strategy, maintaining influence while avoiding the brutal purges that condemned others. Diana's ancestry includes branches connected to the Hastings, further tying her to those who navigated turbulent courts with intellect and caution. The Hastings legacy is a reminder of how families learned to survive in environments where one misstep could lead to execution. The Tudors were also known for their mastery of propaganda. They crafted an image of stability and divine right, even as the true nature of their rule depended heavily on fear. Henry Roman VII used genealogical claims, royal symbols, and public ceremony to justify his right to rule despite his shaky bloodline. Henry Roman VIII used portraits by artists like Hans Holbein to project power and command. Elizabeth I perfected the use of royal imagery to establish herself as the Virgin Queen, an almost divine monarch. These tactics shaped how the aristocracy understood power, teaching them that appearances could be a shield or a weapon. Over generations, noble families internalized these lessons, adopting their own forms of carefully cultivated image management. By the time Diana was born, her family, the Spencers, were masters of projecting dignity, heritage, and aristocratic refinement. Yet beneath that polished image lay another inheritance from Tudor England, the expectation of duty above personal happiness. Women of noble blood were raised for marriage alliances, their lives shaped by expectations of loyalty, obedience, and public composure. Anne Boleyn learned this painfully. So did Catherine Howard, another queen executed by Henry Roman VIII. Even Elizabeth I, who refused marriage altogether, understood that her personal desires must serve the needs of the monarchy. This idea, passed down through generations, influenced how families raised their daughters. In this tradition, noble women were taught to navigate political and social pressures with grace, even when they were deeply unhappy. It is here, in this emotional inheritance, that we begin to see the parallels between Princess Diana and her Tudor ancestors. Just as Anne Boleyn entered a marriage shaped by political expectations rather than romantic fulfillment, Diana entered a royal marriage where the institution mattered more than individual happiness. Like the Tudor women, she was thrust into a system with rigid rules, relentless scrutiny, and little room for emotional expression. The Tudor court and the modern British monarchy differed greatly in brutality, but the underlying pressures of duty, image, and control remained similar. Another sinister element of Tudor legacy is the culture of secrecy that developed during their rule. The Tudors kept tight control over information, shaping narratives and suppressing truths. Letters were destroyed, histories were written, and witnesses silenced. The true motivations behind many decisions remain hidden. This culture of secrecy influenced later monarchies and noble families, creating environments where public image mattered more than private truth. Diana entered such a world, one where silence was expected, where sensitive matters were hidden rather than addressed openly. Her struggles with media intrusion and institutional secrecy reflect the same patterns that once governed Tudor courts. Princess Diana's lineage also connects her to the Fitzalan and Devereux families, both of which played important roles in Tudor political life. The Fitzalans were Earls of Arundel, a title carrying immense prestige. They maneuvered successfully through multiple reigns, safeguarding their power by aligning strategically with monarchs. The Devereux family produced Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a favorite of Elizabeth I, who ultimately faced execution for rebellion. These families contributed to a pattern of ambition and downfall that repeated throughout Tudor history. Their blood, too, flowed in Diana's veins, connecting her to stories of loyalty, betrayal, courage, and tragedy. By the time the Spencers rose to national prominence, centuries had passed since the Tudors. Yet the aristocracy they belonged to was shaped by the world the Tudors created. Social hierarchy, royal loyalty, honor, and duty were values inherited from that era. Diana grew up in a family steeped in these traditions. Her childhood was filled with expectations of proper behavior, noble responsibility, and public service. These values, though softened by modernity, still carried the weight of history. They reflected ancient lessons learned in the violent, glittering, dangerous courts of Tudor kings and queens. The sinister Tudor legacy hiding in her bloodline is not a curse or a myth. It is the inheritance of a world built on ambition and fear, where love was often secondary to power, where women were shaped by forces beyond their control, and where survival depended on silence, strategy, and sacrifice. Diana, unknowingly, stepped into a modern echo of this ancient world, and just as her ancestors were shaped by the demands of monarchy, she too would become a symbol of its pressures and contradictions. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the ancient threads of Tudor blood had woven themselves into the aristocratic fabric of Britain. Families who once stood in the shadows of Henry Roman VIII's court now lived in country estates, served as politicians, officers, diplomats, or patrons of art. They moved in circles defined less by royal suspicion and more by tradition and public duty. Among these families were the Spencers, one of the few noble houses whose prestige matched that of the royal family itself. Their heritage was not merely old, it was illuminated by centuries of political influence, strategic marriages, and ancestral ties stretching back to the turbulent era of the Tudors. And it was into this world that Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961. To understand how the Tudor legacy shaped Diana, we must explore the world of the Spencer family, its origins, its role in British history, and the expectations placed on those born into it. The Spencers had risen to prominence during the 16th and 17th centuries through successful wool trading, followed by land acquisitions that transformed them into one of England's great landowning families. Over time, they secured political positions, military commands, and marriages that linked them to the most powerful aristocratic houses. By the Georgian and Victorian eras, the Spencers were considered equal in status to the royal family, even marrying into branches of royalty. This was not a sudden ascent, but the result of centuries of strategic navigation through a political landscape shaped by Tudor values. One of the most significant Tudor-era connections in the Spencer lineage came through the marriage of their ancestors into families tied directly to Mary Boleyn. As genealogists have confirmed, Diana descended from Mary's daughter, Catherine Carey, who carried the Bolin legacy into future generations. Catherine's life was much different from that of her mother and aunt. She married Francis Knollys, an influential courtier, and became a trusted lady, in waiting to Queen Elizabeth I. Catherine's loyalty and discretion were valued in a court where every word could shift alliances. Her children continued to serve the Tudor monarchs, occupying roles that demanded loyalty and political skill. Through this line, the Spencers inherited not only noble blood, but the lessons of survival learned by a family that had witnessed both the glory and the terror of Tudor power. Another Tudor-linked ancestor in Diana's lineage was Lettice Knollys, daughter of Catherine Carey. Lettice married Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the favourite of Elizabeth I. This marriage created waves of scandal. Elizabeth was furious, banishing Lettice from court for marrying the man she herself was rumoured to love. The resulting tension marked Lettice as a woman who challenged royal expectations, a trait she passed on to her descendants. The Spencer family often viewed this ancestor as a symbol of independence and strength, qualities Diana would later embody in her own conflicts with the royal institution. Through her aristocratic ancestry, Diana also carried the blood of the Beauforts, reinforcing her connection to the founding of the Tudor dynasty. These links were not vague or symbolic. They were documented through centuries of genealogical records. In fact, when Diana became engaged to Prince Charles in 1981, historians quickly noted that she was more aristocratic in lineage than her future husband. Her bloodline carried older and deeper noble roots, many of which traced directly back to families tied to the tumult of Tudor politics. This reality challenged the public narrative that she was a commoner. In truth, she came from a family shaped by ancient royal ties, political alliances, and centuries of navigating courts shaped in the Tudor mold. Diana's upbringing at Park House and later at Althorpe, the Spencer ancestral estate, reflected the weight of this heritage. Althorpe itself, with its grand halls, portraits of ancestors, and libraries filled with centuries of records, symbolizes the long, reaching influence of England's aristocracy. Walking those halls as a child, Diana would have seen faces of relatives who lived through the last days of Henry Roman VIII's tyranny, who served Elizabeth I during her golden age, who survived the English Civil War, and who guided the country during the Georgian reform movements. Each portrait represented a chapter in the long story of how families like the Spencers endured political shifts by adhering to principles inherited from Tudor political culture: loyalty, discretion, controlled public image, and careful alliance building. Yet the Tudor legacy carried darker lessons as well, especially in how noble families managed their internal affairs. The Tudor world had taught families to avoid scandal at all costs. Reputation was everything. This mentality persisted through the centuries, shaping aristocratic behavior. Problems were concealed. Public perfection was emphasized. Private pain was endured silently. Diana grew up in a family where emotional restraint was expected. Her parents' troubled marriage and eventual divorce were painful reminders of how families often struggled behind closed doors despite their elegant, controlled public personas. This duality of image versus reality mirrors the Tudor world, where queens smiled at banquets while fearing for their lives, and courtiers offered compliments while plotting rivals' downfalls. The sinister aspect of this inherited culture lies in the expectation that noblewomen must fulfill their duties regardless of personal suffering. Tudor women were raised to be obedient, poised, and resourceful. They learned to endure political marriages, emotional neglect, and dangerous accusations. This legacy carried into the modern aristocracy. Diana's childhood taught her to be gentle, graceful, and outwardly composed. She excelled at caring for others, showing warmth that contrasted with the reserve common among her peers. Yet this kindness masked vulnerabilities that would later become magnified within the royal environment. The lessons passed down from Tudor-era noblewomen instructed Diana, consciously or not, to prioritize duty over emotional needs, a pattern that shaped her adult life. The Tudor legacy also influenced how Diana was perceived by the royal family. The British monarchy, despite its modern veneer, retained structures and expectations rooted in centuries-old traditions. When Diana entered the royal institution, she encountered protocols built on values that originated in Tudor England: strict hierarchy, controlled public narrative, separation between personal emotion and public duty, and an expectation of loyalty without question. For a woman carrying the blood of the Boleyns, Beauforts, and Elizabeth Woodville, this world felt ironically familiar in its dynamics, but painfully outdated in its demands. In many ways, Diana embodied the strengths of her Tudor ancestors. Like Anne Boleyn, she possessed charisma that captivated crowds. Like Elizabeth of York, she brought a sense of unity and hope. Like Catherine Carey, she proved loyal and dutiful. Like Lettice Knollys, she challenged expectations, refusing to be silent in the face of injustice. Yet, these same traits put her at odds with a system that valued control over individuality. Her modern compassion clashed with ancient expectations. Her emotional openness contradicted aristocratic traditions of secrecy. Her growing influence threatened established structures, just as Anne Boleyn's had centuries earlier. One cannot overlook the symbolic parallels between Diana and the Tudor women from whom she descended. Anne Boleyn was destroyed by a system that feared her influence. Catherine Howard, another young woman placed into a royal marriage, struggled under the weight of court expectations. Elizabeth Woodville was blamed for political tensions she did not create. Even Elizabeth I, arguably the most powerful of them all, lived a life defined by duty rather than personal fulfillment. Diana's journey through the royal world mirrored many of these experiences. She was adored by the public, scrutinized by the institution, isolated within palace life, and ultimately overwhelmed by the contradictions of her role. The sinister Tudor legacy hiding in her bloodline is therefore not about malevolent myth. It is about inherited structures of power, expectation, silence, and duty. It is about the rise and fall of women who challenged or endured these structures. It is about the costs paid by those born into families shaped by centuries of political survival. Diana lived these echoes. They followed her into her marriage, her public image, her struggles with mental health, and her desire to break free from the constraints of royal life. The Tudor legacy living within Princess Diana's bloodline was not merely an ancestral curiosity. It echoed in her experiences, shaped the pressures she faced, reflected in the expectations placed upon her, and even resonated in the dramatic arc of her life. To understand what sinister inheritance lies hidden in her lineage, we must step into the final layer of this story, how 5 centuries of royal politics, Tudor ambition, aristocratic conditioning, and historical trauma manifested symbolically and emotionally in the life of the 20th century. Most beloved princess. When Diana joined the royal family in 1981, millions saw her as a fairy tale figure. She was young, beautiful, shy, seemingly plucked from an ordinary background to become the Princess of Wales. But this narrative was incomplete and misleading. Diana was not an outsider. She came from one of the oldest and most noble families in Britain, with blood that connected her directly to multiple royal houses, including the Tudors. Her ancestors included women who had survived courts far more dangerous than Buckingham Palace. Yet the ancient patterns of royal marriage dynamics that defined their lives persisted into hers. Diana's struggles within the royal institution mirrored the struggles faced by Tudor-era women whose identities were shaped and constrained by power. The sinister Tudor legacy begins with the idea that royal women are symbolic figures. In Tudor England, queens consort were expected to embody virtue, obedience, and dignity. Their personal happiness mattered far less than their political usefulness. Marriages were alliances. Their public smiles were required even when their private lives were unbearable. Anne Boleyn learned this when her inability to produce a male heir placed her in deadly danger. Catherine Howard learned it when her past became political ammunition. Even Catherine of Aragon, the deeply respected first wife of Henry Roman VIII, was discarded despite decades of loyalty. Diana, 5 centuries later, stepped into a system that still carried remnants of this thinking. As the wife of the future king, she was expected to fit a mold. She was expected to prioritize duty above emotion, to maintain composure, and to uphold the prestige of the monarchy. Her role demanded public perfection, a smiling presence at state events, and a controlled image orchestrated by courtiers. But Diana was not a woman molded by silence. She felt deeply. She empathized intensely. She refused to accept that her personal pain must be hidden for the sake of tradition. This clash between individual authenticity and institutional expectation was one of the defining conflicts of her life. This conflict echoes exactly the struggle faced by Tudor women who stepped outside the role assigned to them. Anne Boleyn challenged the norms of her era by refusing to be a silent mistress and insisting on marriage. Lettice Knollys challenged Elizabeth I's authority by marrying Robert Dudley, the Queen's favourite. Even Elizabeth Woodville challenged medieval norms by marrying King Edward Roman, for love rather than political calculation. These women were condemned, resented, or feared because they pursued personal agency in a world that expected otherwise. Diana inherited their spirit. She was not content to be a decorative figure. She sought emotional connection, compassion, driven work, and authenticity. Her humanitarian efforts, particularly her work with AIDS patients, landmine victims, and marginalized communities, reflected a moral courage that transcended royal expectations. In Tudor times, such influence would have been interpreted as political power and therefore viewed as dangerous. In Diana's time, it still challenged the institution's desire for control. The monarchy struggled with her growing worldwide popularity, just as Tudor monarchs once struggled with the rising influence of their consorts or favorites. Another sinister element of the Tudor legacy is the culture of secrecy. The Tudors perfected the art of managing information. Henry Roman VII controlled public narratives through proclamations. Henry Roman VIII manipulated court records, rewriting the reasons for executions. Elizabeth I commissioned histories that painted her reign in a specific light. Truth was crafted, curated, and controlled. This practice of shaping public perception became embedded in the British monarchy for centuries. Diana found herself locked inside a modern version of this environment. Her life within the palace was subject to strict control of information. Correspondence, press statements, and even her medical disclosures were filtered by royal staff. When she began to break this silence, giving voice to her struggles, it disrupted the institution's long-standing tradition of secrecy. Her interview with the BBC in 1995 was an act of rebellion not unlike those of her Tudor ancestors who dared to speak truths that power preferred to suppress. Her words changed public perceptions of the monarchy and revealed the emotional cost of her position. There is a deeper, symbolic connection to her Tudor lineage through the theme of public adoration coupled with institutional hostility. Anne Boleyn was adored by many common people early in her rise, just as Diana became the people's princess. Elizabeth I commanded extraordinary loyalty from her subjects, yet both Anne and Elizabeth faced intense hostility from the political structures around them. Diana experienced a similar dynamic. She was loved by the public, yet her life inside the palace walls was fraught with isolation, misunderstandings, and emotional struggles. This divide between public affection and private suffering reflects one of the most sinister and enduring themes in Tudor history. Even Diana's tragic death carried echoes of Tudor symbolism. The Tudors lived in a world where powerful women met destructive ends, not because of fate but because of the pressures placed upon them. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were executed. Lady Jane Grey was sacrificed to political convenience. Margaret Douglas's children faced repeated dangers from shifting dynastic alliances. The pattern is not a literal curse, but a cultural inheritance. The monarchy struggles to accommodate women who are beloved, independent, and unwilling to conform. In Diana's case, though her death was accidental and not the result of political persecution, the emotional and societal pressures that shaped her journey mirrored those faced by Tudor women before her. She lived under constant media scrutiny, institutional rigidity, and the immense burden of public expectation. Her desire for freedom, emotional fulfillment, and authenticity placed her in conflict with a system built on centuries of controlled image. Her death in 1997 felt like the ending of a historical cycle that began centuries earlier in the courts of Henry Roman VIII. Yet perhaps the most powerful aspect of the Tudor legacy hiding in Diana's bloodline is not its sinister shadow, but its transformational energy. Through her Tudor ancestors, Diana inherited courage, charisma, intelligence, and the ability to move hearts. She used these qualities to reshape public perceptions of royalty. She modernized compassion. She humanized the throne. She softened the monarchy's image not through formal reforms, but through emotional truth, humanitarian work, and connection with ordinary people. From Anne Boleyn, she inherited boldness. From Elizabeth Woodville, resilience. From Margaret Beaufort, a sense of destiny. From Catherine Carey and Lettice Knollys, a refusal to remain silent. Though the Tudor courts were marked by ruthlessness and ambition, they also produced some of England's most influential and transformative women. Diana became the modern embodiment of that lineage. Her children, Prince William and Prince Harry, inherited this historical legacy as well. Through Diana, the future of the monarchy is connected not only to the Windsors, but to the Tudors and the powerful noble houses that shaped British history. William, as future king, carries the blood of Henry Roman VII, Elizabeth of York, the Boleyns, the Greys, the Careys, and the Spencers.